Hello and welcome to Hare in the Hawthorn. My name's Kate Ray and I'm one of your two hosts. We've got Neil with us. I don't know whether he's back or not back because we don't know what time has been in between and who's been in between, but Neil's with me, which is absolutely great. So our guest today is, I'm really excited about this, and because it's a subject that I tend to veer away from quite a bit because it's one of the last taboos in my whole paranormal paraphernalia toolbox. And that's the world of UFOs. And I'll just briefly say that the film E.T. terrified me as a child to the point where I screamed and cried all the way through, even though I was told that E.T. was the good guy. He wasn't, and I think I must have been abducted in a former life or something to know that he was the bad guy. Anyway, we've got Bob Digby. I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the things that Bob has been involved in and is involved in. Like with all, I guess, though, it's this person has got multiple facets to them. So just this brief thing is just very, very brief. So Bob was chairman of the British UFO Association. He was just telling us that that's no longer in existence, and I'm sure that's something that he will elaborate on. He was an editor for Quest for Knowledge magazine, and he's also a filmmaker, which, again, we're going to elaborate on those things probably a little further down. So I want to welcome you, Bob. Thank you for coming on and giving up your time and having a chat with us this evening. How are you doing?
Fine, thanks. Yes, hi, Kate. Hi, Neil. Thanks for having me on. I've been looking forward to this as well, and I feel as though we're sort of pioneering a trail here, especially if this is one of your taboo subjects. I'll try not to terrify you.
No, please do. I've opened up a Pandora's box. This is it. I'm going to face my fear. That's what
Excellent.
I'm going to do.
Fair enough.
Neil, you wanted to crack on and start off with a particular question, didn't you? A particular issue.
Yep, great to have you here with us, Bob.
Yeah, hi,
and
Neil.
Seeing at the time of recording this, we have had what is usually called a UFO flap in the United States. We've already talked to Thomas Sheridan about this, and some of you may have seen that video which went out last weekend, where Thomas has some of his own very unique views on what might be happening there. But seeing it in the news, Bob, and seeing that there are a lot of anomalies around it, aren't there? And a lot of questions being asked. So, yeah, we don't have to spend too long on this, but what do you think's going on?
Well, I think it's a good question because it's topical, it's in the news, and here's my take on things. Interesting observation number one is to do with the use of language. And if you paid close attention to early reports in the news, the term UFO wasn't used originally. It was described as some unidentified objects.
Yes.
So I found the use of that language quite interesting. And Kate has already touched on a slight raw nerve. It's the connotations associated with the term UFO. So to be clear and not to get too deep into semantic arguments, UFO simply means unidentified flying objects, but the problem is what people associate with it. So point number one is that the US government or any spokespeople initially were very careful about trying not to use the UFO term, and we heard about unidentified objects. Now that has changed because obviously the press get hold of the story and they're into UFOs. So in the pure sense of the term, these are UFOs. I think we can safely say that the first big object that was shot down was a Chinese surveillance balloon. And as we speak, the payload is being analysed and looked at. And I think over time, more information will be released about it. But obviously, the Chinese are saying it's an innocent weather balloon. But the payload seemed to have a lot of sophisticated communications intelligence technology. So who knows what that could have sent forward in terms of gathering signals intelligence. The other three objects that have cropped up, and it's very interesting that in a concentrated period of time, there's been several other what I'm going to call UFOs, so excuse me, but these seem to be different, and the hint seems to be that these are not of Chinese origin. One of them was a hexagonal shape, I believe, or maybe was it octagonal? I can't remember.
It was hexagonal.
It
yes.
was hexagonal. Okay, thanks. And there was some question about how this was keeping aloft. Now, the security threat comes from the height at which that and the others were operating. There's a picture in recent news that was a selfie taken on board a U-2 spy plane by a pilot. And that was of the original Chinese balloon operating at something like about 80,000 feet. But the hexagonal one that you've mentioned, I think, had a height of about 40,000. So anything between 20,000 and 40,000 feet is the kind of air corridor that commercial aircraft use. And from that point of view, it's a hazard. But what's interesting about these latter three objects is that they seem to be a little bit more mysterious in their origin. One theory that I've heard put forward is that these are sort of test aircraft, possibly being flown by, you know, some corporation developing an experimental craft. But the interesting thing from the angle of the press and questions to the appropriate American general, whose name I can't remember, is when pressed on the extraterrestrial angle, he said something to the effect of, well, everything's on the table. He's not discounting anything. But then he referred it to the backroom intelligence boys to dig up the relevant information and see what conclusions they could come to. So in summary, the jury is still out on these other objects, very different from the balloon that was shot down, apparently, and not a lot has been given away. If ever it will be, because obviously they're only going to disclose so much. And there might be things that they don't want to disclose. So we'll have to see how the story develops. But my main interest with this was the very, very careful use of language.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, Bob. But and just to finish up on that, the other aspect of this that I find quite interesting, excuse me, is the way the media has changed in the way they report UFOs. Actually, before a little bit before this event, I mean, if you go back 5 years ago, any story about possible unidentified flying objects that might be extraterrestrial, intraterrestrial, whatever you want to call them, would have been an object of ridicule. It would have been that last item on the news where it's, and someone's seen a UFO. Whereas that seems to have changed in the last few years. And I definitely noticed the difference when they were covering this story. It's almost as though the media have been given permission by the government or the military, and then we've been given permission to actually say, well, there might be something going on here. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think you're bang on, and it's what I would call a rebranding exercise. I've come to the conclusion that UFOs is a disinformation term. It's tarnished, it's associated with the gag boys. You know, you've been seeing UFOs, you must have had too many down at the pub, ho ho. And there's a real problem with the use of language. One of the things I hate if I've been on a TV or a radio show is being asked, oh, do you believe in UFOs? Now, the reason I hate the question is it's not necessarily about believing in something. It's not like some religious quest, or do I believe in this, or do I believe in that? In fact, it reminds me of an old Monty Python gag about believing that a brontosaurus is thick in the middle and thin at both ends. You know, it's a complete wrong approach, if I can put it that way. What the interviewers normally mean is, do you think some UFOs, underlined 10 times, are extraterrestrial spacecraft? That's what they really mean, but that's not what they ask. And I'm going to get into another controversy here that, you know, let's just say for argument, and this is embarrassing because I teach mathematics, that let's say for argument, 90% are explainable. And that leaves a 10% residue that are unidentifiable, remain unidentified, are totally mysterious. Now, one of the arguments is, what is that residue? So one school of thought, it's as low as 2%. The other school of thought is as high as 20%. So there is a mysterious rump in the figures regarding UFOs. The other thing from the scientific point of view is that UFOs are not a single class of event. It's a very wide church, if I can use that word. That's probably the wrong word to use, but forgive me. It covers strange technology objects, aircraft that are difficult or impossible to identify, but it can also include small glowing orbs and spheres, and other things. So it's almost like a dustbin of a complete range of different things which are not under one convenient heading. And Neil's put his finger on something there, because the dialogue has shifted, and there is this term UAP that has suddenly started appearing. So given that UFOs are tarnished and they're not a single class of event, I think the rebranding has occurred as part of a new agenda to make the subject more respectable. But there were some things that have happened in the United States, and I'm just going to refer to a note so I don't get this wrong. But in 2007, there was an organization set up. Let me just make sure I get the name right, because it's been misreported in the press. The correct name was the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. It's a bit of a mouthful. It's known as, or was known as, ATIP. AATIP, and the budget for this was $22 million over a 5-year period. So it's a little bit odd, isn't it, that UFOs are a laughing matter, but you've got one example here of the US government throwing some serious money at this, because they perceive that there's some sort of threat identification process. So that's the first thing. So the second point, this rebranding that we've talked about, okay, which I think the underlying purpose of it is actually to encourage more military reporting. Now, what is little known is that since 1969 in Canada and the US, there was a military reporting procedure. It was known as JNAP 146. So that's Joint Army, Navy, Air Force procedure to encourage uniform reporting of strange objects, which could include foreign military, but anything that's unexplained. So I'm going to revert to the term UFO that the military have been taking seriously for a very long time. And I had a discussion about this with a former Undersecretary of State for Defence, Ralph Noyes, who worked for the Ministry of Defence. And if you think back to the Second World War, in 1944, there were sightings of strange noisy objects that made a funny noise, were very small and had wings, and were nicknamed doodlebugs. But those reports became very important because they had consequences. They were the first flying bombs that no one had ever seen before. And once the engine cut out, you had 7 seconds before there was an almighty explosion. And they were very hard to defend against. So there's an example of where reports of strange unidentified flying objects, because they weren't called that then, had consequences and mattered a very great deal. Now, switching back to this UAP, which I think in an email exchange, Kate, you told me you'd never heard of it and didn't know what it was. So these are the unidentified aerial phenomena. So this is part of the rebranding. And the definition of a UAP, okay, which has come out of this Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, is that there are 5 very, very important characteristics which are extremely difficult to explain. I'm just going to refer to my notes so I don't get this wrong. But the first characteristic is sudden and instantaneous acceleration. So defying the laws of physics, and that if you were a pilot inside one of these things performing those maneuvers, you'd be spread all over the inside of the craft. So we won't get too gory. Hypersonic vehicles, so many times faster than the speed of sound, but without a signature. So what that means is the objects can travel at supersonic speeds, but there's no obvious signature such as heat, sound, electromagnetic signatures, anything like that. The next one, number 3, is low observability. So that means that it's very hard to see with the naked eye. It might be cloaked in some way, or it's only detected through something like an infrared camera, not in the visible spectrum. The 4th one is what is called transmedium travel. So without any obvious change to the structure of the object, can travel in the air, in the sea. So there's a new term for you if you haven't heard it, USOs. These things could travel extremely fast underwater, in the air, and off into space, and yet, you know, there's no change in the shape or of the object, or its performance isn't impeded. And the last one is something called positive lift, and that's the ability to resist the natural effects of Earth's gravity. So a hint that there's a sort of an anti-gravity element. And if you bring all 5 of these together, the question then becomes, well, who's got this capability? Whose technology is this? And this is what brings us into some of the reports that have now been released about the study of these, because this is a problem. The Americans are saying it's not us. We don't have this capability. So who's got it? Is it the Russians? Is it the Chinese? Or who? And it doesn't look like it. When somebody has a technology advantage, and I'm going to pick the example of the F-117 stealth fighter, it was kept secret for a good while. But then when the first Gulf War occurred, these aircraft were deployed militarily. So I'm going to suggest to you that sooner or later, if you've got some secret technology, it gets played out in some dramatic world scenario, and then the can of beans is spilt. So it doesn't stay secret forever. But this is a complete set of anomalies, and the technology that would be required for these 5 characteristics I've just told you is, well, it's quite mind-blowing. You know, do we have that capability? And if someone has it, could they keep it secret for that long? So there's a rebranding, and I think it's to encourage more military reporting. And if I can just again refer to some notes here, I won't hold this up because you're not going to be able to see it, but in June of 2021, there was a preliminary assessment on unidentified aerial phenomena, and that looked at 144 cases of high strangeness, some of which were explained. And then I've got the 2022 report here. And would you believe that in 2022, an organization called the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, who studies this stuff, so this is kind of a successor to ATIP, last year they had 366 UAP reports. So do the math. In 1 year, it's gone from 144 anomalous reports of UAPs to 366, with a large number of them not explained. And just as a very quick PS, another recent story that either of you might have picked up on is that President Biden just signed off on a National Defense Authorization Act. And within that act, it covers rapid UFO response teams, or should I say UAP, the scientific study of UAPs, the investigation of health-related aspects to UAP encounters, and mandates government transparency or greater government transparency on the topic. Now, if this is all a waste of everybody's time and nonsense and utter rubbish, why on earth are they spending all this effort?
Yeah, definitely. I've got 1,000,001 questions already. It's popping my brain. So one of the ones that I'd like to explore with you, just very, very briefly. I'll do the 2 questions together. Is you spoke about the 10 to 20% of unexplainable cases that happen. and it'd be nice to hear what kind of things fall into that bracket. The other one is just topping off what you've just said about the change in terminology. Very much we've seen this within the faery realm and faery investigation. When you start changing the terminology for something, people then start going, oh, so it's not that just one narrow thing. So if people think of UFOs as, you know, the flying saucers or the triangular kind of military planes that they're seeing, anything else outside of that, whether they're seeing orbs of light or something else, whereas before people didn't know where to report it, now they've got that kind of umbrella to be able to report that phenomenon under. And leading on from that, the second question that I want to explore in some depth is where biological unidentified UAPs, where do they fit? So for instance, things like skyfish, where do they, are they still seen as kind of woo-woo things, or is that something that's, you know, jumping in with that kind of terminology? So the first one was in that 10 to 20%, if you could give me give us some examples of what falls into that, the phenomena of not being able to explain what's happening.
Okay, well, the short answer is that it's the more exotic type of cases, not just simple lights in the sky, that type of thing. Dr. J. Allen Hynek was the handiest astronomer to the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So arguably the luck of geography and the significance of the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base was that it had the Foreign Technology Division, and the UFO category fitted in nicely with their remit. Now, Dr. Hynek was the consultant to the US Air Force Project Blue Book, which was the sort of public PR world type analysis, but I think the really serious stuff went on behind the scenes. And Dr. Hynek used a classification system of 6 categories of cases. Now you'll see where I'm going with this, and I better just make sure I don't get this wrong. His 6 categories were daylight discs, nocturnal lights, radar visual cases, and notice that as we get to radar visual, there's a bit of physical evidence coming along here, some data that can back up a visual sighting with some radar information. And then 3 categories of close encounters. So there were close encounters of the first kind, close encounters of this. So in other words, a close-up sighting of some sort of piece of technology. Close encounters of the second type, which were, or second kind, I should say, where physical traces were left. So ground traces, that type of thing. And the very famous close encounters of the third kind, where the film got its title from. And in fact, Dr. Hynek makes a Hitchcock type appearance in the film. Now, where am I going with this? Well, the answer to your question is that it's in these more exotic cases. So an example of a close encounter of the third kind would be something like the Barney and Betty Hill case, which occurred in 1961, but was made very famous in this country by the Sunday Mirror in 1966. And people were riveted because it was the first very public case where a couple claimed that they had seen a spacecraft, and under hypnosis, it was revealed that they had been abducted, taken aboard, and subjected to physical examinations. Now, to this day, bearing in mind this case occurred in 1961, it really isn't explained. You might think, well, hang on, isn't it obvious? You just mentioned aliens and a spacecraft and abduction, but not everybody sort of accepts that. But this is an example of something that's not easily explained away, whichever camp you want to sit in, either that you think this is a nonsense and they were imagining it, or you think they really were taken by aliens. You know, people are entitled to their opinion. But what is the explanation then for such a bizarre case, and the fact that there was physical evidence and a lot came out under hypnosis? there have been more modern sightings that are very difficult to explain. And another example would be the US Navy footage, which I expect you're aware of, affectionately known as the Tic Tac and the gimbal. And a very interesting point, I'm assuming most of your viewers will have seen this on the news or seen it on YouTube. And some of the things I'm touching on, I hope to provide you with some links and references in sort of proper academic procedure. But the point is that was released by the US Navy, and it was confirmed that this is genuine footage taken from fighter aircraft, which have very, very sophisticated radars and other intelligence gathering equipment that's classified. But it allows you to see from a pilot's point of view accurate information about speed, distance, and some of these impossible characteristics that I've just told you define a UAP. So that's a rather long, short answer, if you'll forgive me, but it's the answer is it's the more exotic cases. And I'd very quickly, before somebody writes to you and complains, Alan Hynek told me that these 6 categories were meant to be private. He never intended that they be made public. They were for his personal reference to categorize, the piles of files that he had. Since they were made public, some other people have added a couple of categories. So some people may have heard of a CE4, or a close encounter of the 4th kind. So the definition of that is literally the abduction scenario where there is an encounter with alien beings. And very often these cases come to light under hypnosis. And then a CE5 has been added, particularly championed by Dr. Stephen Greer, which is deliberate protocols to establish communications with extraterrestrial beings. So they were CE4, CE5 were not part of Alan Hynek's original 6 categories. They've been added subsequently. But can you see that with these categories, this subject is evolving, getting into more controversial waters? And by the way, a bit like some of the things you've been involved in, its tentacles are going into other branches of inquiry, shall we say. So for example, the wider UFO phenomenon is having tentacles that go into things like crop circles, cattle mutilations, a whole load of bizarre areas that, again, very, very difficult to explain in sort of conventional terms.
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, we love long answers. We really do. And the other one that's definitely close to mine and Neil's heart is those crossover links between faery folklore and ufology, when you're talking about anomalous lights and in the sky that would have been explained in a very different way, and so how that terminology has evolved over the last 100 years is incredibly interesting. But it seems to be going at such a rapid speed now with all things that I think it is a good thing, because it opens up the debate about the cross links between loads of different phenomena that go on. I did briefly mention, and I'm hoping it kind of ties into one of the things that you said you wanted to talk about, which is fascinating me. You used the term flying snakes, which I'm hoping that this is going to be the perfect link, but I could be way off on this. So I mentioned, as I asked you the last question, about skyfish, and that's a term that I've only in the last 2 or 3 years sort of come across. I'll give you a very, very brief rundown. I had I was on a flight. I was on a flight back from somewhere on my own, and saw something out the window of the plane. If the person behind me hadn't confirmed that he could see it, I thought I was going mad. And the only way that I could describe it, because of its movement, was it was a dragon. It moved very much undulating, and it was massive. It passed by another plane, and it was 3 or 4 times the size of a passenger aeroplane, but it was transparent. It was almost like you couldn't see it, but it had that very, very long, snaky type effect to it. And talking to some other ufologists about it, and they said, it sounds like a classic skyfish, you know, that, and there is belief that these are biological things that actually exist in the ether. I'm hoping that's the entrance into flying snakes. If not, let's start off with where are you sitting with the skyfish theory, and then please tell us about flying snakes.
All right. Well, you've it's not quite the link, but let's answer your question about biological entities. I wasn't thinking I'm not sure if this is exactly the same thing as flying fish, but I've seen some videos of what I'm going to call flying rods.
Yes.
And the rod videos are an anomaly. And that crept into the UFO field as well. So I'm going to call them unidentified flying objects. But it is so peculiar. And the videos I've seen of these flying rods are so difficult to explain. A possible explanation, which I could buy into, is the fact that they are some sort of life form whose domain is simply within our atmosphere. And it's not necessarily so far-fetched. I mean, you could say birds do pretty well in the atmosphere, you know, flying from tree to tree and what have you. So the idea that there are some undiscovered, unnamed biological species that exist in other environments is perfectly plausible. And I think what we know about you know, creatures that we thought were extinct and weren't. So, for example, a fisherman caught a coelacanth, which is a sort of prehistoric fish, but he caught one. So obviously not as extinct as we thought. And then there's new discoveries being made. So it's perfectly possible that these rods flying, I'll call them flying rods, but if you call them flying, what was the term? Flying fish? Skyfish, sorry. Perfectly possible that this is the discovery of some biological creature that we didn't know existed, possibly because it's in a very limited environment or something. I don't know, but that's perfectly possible. But I can confirm that I'll try and provide you with a link. I think on YouTube I've seen a video of some flying rods, so make of it what you will, but I don't have a good explanation. But you can understand how that sort of phenomenon has crept into the UFO world. Let me put you out of your misery regarding the flying snakes. Mark Jones, who I think is responsible for us getting together. I've known Mark for 40 years, and he happens to be Lionel's agent. So there's a bit of a thread here. Lionel Fanthorpe, who you had on last week. Back in 1983, I was the chairman of Bufora, and we were planning an international UFO Congress. And Mark, at the time, was involved with marketing and promotions. So he was helping us with the organization of the conference. But he was fascinated by all of these subjects as well. And we've been friends ever since and have collaborated on a number of things. Now, 5 years ago, Mark asked me if I could do a boardroom presentation to a film company in Cardiff. And I thought, why on earth would I want to do that? And he had made a pitch for a science fiction series. Memory serves, I think it was about 26 episodes. It featured aliens who were not very nice and didn't mean us good things at all. In fact, I think they wanted to eat us. But anyway, what he wanted was somebody who could convince the film company that there were all these other weird and wonderful subjects out there, and that various episodes could take us off into, you know, animal mutilations, other, you know, crop circles, you know, the whole thing. So I put together a presentation called From Flying Snakes to Flying Saucers. And the reason I chose flying snakes was to illustrate how myths and legends are born and how they can come into existence. And David Attenborough, with a BBC film crew working in the jungles of Borneo, was able to capture a flying snake on film. So you can imagine that back in olden times, you know, people going out hunting in the jungle, they see a flying snake, capture whatever food they're going to go back to base and mention the fact that they've seen flying snakes, and probably some people back at base didn't believe it. Now that there is film footage of this, we now know that there are 5 versions of flying snakes that exist in Southeast Asia. And it depends on, again, a semantic argument. What do you mean by flying? Now, the analysis of the airborne footage of the snakes is that they actually fling themselves off of a tree branch, but glide. And astonishingly, they can glide for 100 meters. And what the snake does is curve the underside of its belly, and then you've got a difference in air pressure between the underside of the snake and the top surface of the snake, just like the wings of an aircraft, that provides lift, keeps it airborne, and then like a snake sort of slithers, it can do that in the air and guide itself to the next tree. So number one, there is such a thing as a flying snake. Number two, we know of 5 versions of this in different countries, Indonesia, Borneo, etc., etc. But you can understand how myths spring up, but that it's based on something that triggered the myth in the first place, and then with the actual evidence and frame by frame analysis of the film, you can't deny it. Now, the thing is, when I did this presentation, people in the boardroom didn't believe there was such a thing as a flying snake. And actually, I've just got brief notes here. I talked about 20 topics that they knew little about, from alien implants, crop circles, cases that existed before Roswell, and so Foo Fighters from World War II, you name it. There was 20 things on the list. And at the end of the presentation, there was almost a little cat fight as to who could take my DVD home, because I backed all this up with photographic evidence and reports and what have you. And yeah, the DVD did the rounds of the board members wanting to study this at home in greater detail. And they were astonished. When I finished, there was this stunned silence. But if you ask around, there are still people who don't believe in flying snakes. Mm. So that's the link.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's absolutely, and you're right about the mythology of stuff where people get a snippet of something and it kind of blows up. So when you say flying snake, you expect a snake with wings, don't you? And that's probably part of the mythology that would unfold, where people kind of put what they know together, and it becomes something much bigger.
Yeah, that's it. Well, you can understand how a myth is created, but there's a trigger. There's a reason why it came into being.
Yeah, definitely.
So segueing on from that, it's let's get a little bit more esoteric, if you don't mind.
Oh, by all means.
Because as soon as you're talking about myths and UFOs, whatever you want to call them, I'm immediately what immediately comes to mind is Carl Jung's version of the mythology of flying saucers. I think that was the name of his book, where he first wrote about flying saucers, or UFOs, flying saucers as he called them. Yeah. So well, we won't go too far into Carl Jung because it's such a deep subject, but coming more up to date with how people have approached the phenomenon. And when Kate and I and other folklorists who are open-minded enough to talk about the subject and the correlation between fairy folklore and modern fairy folklore, not just ancient folklore,
sure,
and modern UFOs, most especially in conjunction with the abduction phenomenon. And you will know very well that it was probably bubbling around in the 1960s, but the first person to really articulate that was Jacques Vallée, yes, in Passport to Magonia in 68 or 69, so yeah, 69, I think. Yeah, and where he's talking, can I just read out the most appropriate paragraph, yeah, from Passport to Magonia, just to show you, yeah, what he was saying for listeners who are not familiar with it. So Jacques Vallée says, "The modern global belief in flying saucers and their occupants is identical to an earlier belief in the fairy faith. These entities described as the pilots of the craft are indistinguishable from the elves, sylphs, lutins of the Middle Ages and early modern period. Through the observation of unidentified flying objects, we are concerned with an agency our ancestors knew well and regarded with terror. We are prying into the affairs of the secret Commonwealth. And by the secret Commonwealth, he's referring to the manuscript of Robert Kirk from the late 17th century, where he wrote about Scottish fairies in Aberfoyle. So since Valets has written about that, we've had all sorts of people such as John Keel, Graham Hancock, Patrick Harper, who have made this very tight correlation between what are the fairies and aliens? Are they the same thing? My thought is that there is a lot of correlation, but it will take a lot of unraveling to really get to the bottom of it. So sorry for that long ramble. What do you think?
Well, this is interesting because there's an obvious crossover. In fact, funnily enough, I'm looking at a book at the moment, which is a kind of what's the word I want? Anthology, is that the right word? A catalogue of alien encounters. So somebody has put together a catalogue of having looked at cases that involve aliens, and they've catalogued 82 different types. Now, actually, I've spotted a few that seem to be missing, but we'll just go with this figure of 82. And amongst that figure of 82, there are very small aliens. So the classic grey, who is about 3 to 4 feet tall, up to much, much taller beings that are 7 or 8 feet tall, or even bigger. So within the cataloguing of aliens, in inverted commas, there is a wide spread from small to large. I remember as a kid, we had an Irish lodger who, if I remember right, he was from Kilkenny, and he used to tell me tales of the little people. And as a kid, I was absolutely riveted in his tales of the little people. In fact, I think you had somebody on, I can't remember their name, but they were a bit of an expert in Irish fairy folklore, and I can't pronounce the name that they gave to the little people. It's an Irish name, but anyway.
Yeah, the person would probably, you're probably talking about David Halpin.
Oh, yes, that's it.
You're probably talking about the she.
Okay, yes, spot on. So yes, it's interesting that depending on which sort of viewpoint you put on this, there are sightings of little people. So certainly within the cataloguing of alien cases, there are small beings, as well as very tall ones. It's a bit like the UFO category, where it's, there's lots of things in there that are not a single class of event. And that's the only reservation I would have, that not necessarily the sort of viewpoint of alien in inverted commas necessarily translates into some of the fields that you're talking about, but nevertheless difficult to explain. And the fact that these, I'll use the term myths and legends, but you'll know what I mean, are spread all over the world. And it's a little bit difficult to explain why so many different cultures have these sightings of little people, and their environments and the nature of them.
Yeah, I mean, on a very basic level, it's people's cultural understanding of what they're experiencing, isn't it? And if with little understanding of technology, like, we have more of an understanding of technology and of flight, etc. But when you were living in a period of time where, flight was left to the birds, and it was way out of the realm of people's understanding that humans could actually do that. And they were having these encounters. They were seeing lights in the sky. They were encountering these strange beings. There's definitely that crossover, isn't there, in between fairy folklore and UFOs. And it could be either. I mean, me and Neil have discussed it many times with different people about, is it cultural interpretation, or is it that these things actually have ability to be able to project themselves to us in a way that we would actually understand? understand them. And in today's society, I've spoke about this many times. As a ghost hunter, I can say I've seen a ghost, and people go, oh really, that's interesting. You say that you've seen, you know, a UFO, and people go, oh okay. You say you've seen a fairy, and they look at you like you need locking up, you know. So it's all about that kind of communication that we have. Do you think that is shifting in the right direction? You talked about terminology. Do you think that that's shifting in a positive direction to sort of, you know, get to the bottom of the matter, really?
Well, technology does come into this because we have much better means now of communication. There's lots of stuff on YouTube, which I'll try and reference for things I've mentioned. So there's a lot more information available now, and people, if you like, are better educated as to what's out there. Can I very quickly touch on this culture thing?
Yes.
She's dead now, but when I did the film UFO Review, The Researchers for Bufora, I was taking advantage of the fact that when we had conferences, I'd got some great guests that I could film and interview. And one of the people I interviewed was a lady called Cynthia Hind, who was a very prolific researcher in South Africa and Rhodesia and around that part of the world. And she interviewed a native who she referred to as Clifford. I think this was in Rhodesia. He had an encounter with beings somewhere or other in that country, and he was trying to find the right language to describe what he saw. Now, in the Shona language, there isn't a word for silver, so he had great difficulty explaining that he had seen silver-suited beings. That was one problem. And then he didn't see these beings as aliens or fairies or anything else. He referred to them as visits from his ancestors. And that is an example of, I think, a cultural interpretation. But in the Western world, the cultural interpretation that I'm most used to seeing is it can't be, therefore it isn't.
Mm. Yeah.
But maybe people are now more widely aware of what's out there, and it's opened a few people's eyes. But ask some people you know if they believe there's such a thing as flying snakes, and you'll see what I mean.
No, absolutely. So just staying on that tack for a moment, because the thing that does fascinate me most, I have to say, about the UFO phenomenon is the abduction scenarios, sure, which, like you're saying, they go back beyond Barney and Betty in 1961, don't they? There are previous ones to that.
That's true, yes.
But since that time, obviously, there's been an exponential growth in people who claim or think that they have been abducted by aliens, whatever those aliens are. And of course, as per that passage from Jacques Vallée, we can go back hundreds of years to find very similar fairy abduction cases in the literature. Now, of course, you will know better than anyone that there is a split in, can I call it the UFO community? Is there? I guess there is a UFO community between those people who think that these are nuts and bolts spacecraft coming from alien civilizations, and those who think these, whatever they are either coming from perhaps another dimension. They're here all the time, they're just interacting dimensionally, or that they are coming from something, and this goes back to the Carl Jung idea, that they are coming from a collective human consciousness, and that is what's making them appear. And I just want to get your thoughts on you mentioned earlier to us Bud Hopkins, who is very much of the former opinion, isn't he? He thinks the abductions are by an extraterrestrial race for various genetic purposes.
Yes.
And everything is happening physically, whereas his counterpart, sometime collaborator, I believe, but his counterpart was John Mack, the late John Mack, who very much came from the opinion that these things may be physical, but their primary the primary place they're coming from is the consciousness of the people experiencing it. That doesn't mean, he was never saying, oh, that means they're not real. He's just saying there's some unexplained aspect of consciousness which is making these things happening, and it's probably not nuts and bolts spaceships coming from somewhere else in the universe. What do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, John Mack had a lot of stick. He was a Harvard psychiatrist, and he got into a lot of hot water, and people made a lot of trouble for him for taking an interest in abductions. It's a valid viewpoint, because I think his view was that, well, if these are not real aliens and nuts and bolts spacecraft, then why are these people saying that they've been abducted by aliens? So he's looked at it from his area of expertise, and he wrote a book on it. So it's another valid avenue of inquiry. And this is why I like your platform, because really, if we can forget the gag boys and all the jokes about having too many down at the pub, there is a need for an adult conversation about this. A friend and colleague many years ago, Dr. Hilary Evans, wrote a series of books called The Evidence For. And I had a quick look online. You can still get a reasonably good copy of The Evidence for UFOs. It's not the only one that was in the series. I think he had a go at ghosts and other things. And he wasn't taking a partisan approach, I don't think. He was just sort of saying, look, if you believe in UFOs, if I dare use that phrase, what exactly is the evidence that suggests these things exist? So it was coming from that point of view. And I think if you're going to look at the evidence for abductions, UFOs, ghosts, fairies, whatever you want to name, then we've got to look at all the points of view and consider all the avenues of inquiry. And I think that's why the things you've touched on are perfectly valid lines of inquiry. But of course, the difficulty with things like the Betty and Barney Hill case and a few others I could name is the physical evidence that's involved. And let me just add a further complication, because I'm still in touch with a close encounter witness that I was involved investigating many years ago. Her case was unusual because her incident involved a craft, but she was with her 2 children, and they had missing time when this thing landed on a riverbank where they were walking. And I made the mistake of saying to her one day, what do you think about your abduction, and what can you tell me about the aliens? And she got quite cross with me, sort of saying, I never said they were aliens. And I said, oh, sorry, what did you think they were? And her answer was that I thought they were time travelers. So there's another spin. But it's very, very interesting. What made this particular lady's case unusual is that it wasn't just her. She was with her 2 children. So, there are some of the people involved in these situations have their own interpretation that's different to that of an investigator or somebody taking an outside point of view. And I think all of these things should be looked at from the point of view, what is the evidence that supports this? In many cases, I'd agree, the evidence is not that good. And if we go back to the case of the report on UFOs, infamously known as the Condon Committee, C-O-N-D-O-N. I nearly mispronounced it after Dr. Edward Condon. This was a 2-year study commissioned by the US Air Force. There were very few cases in there that were considered probative, meaning, are they admissible as evidence? Is there enough information in there that this could stand up in court? Although, interestingly, one of the cases that did stand up to scrutiny in that report was the photographs taken in McMinnville, Oregon, which concluded that, a disc-shaped object 10s of meters in diameter did fly within photograph taking distance of a couple of witnesses. It's one of the very few cases that was held up as, dare I use this expression, but a genuine UFO.
Yeah.
Can I ask, and I know that this is probably slightly bringing down the tone. I know we've talked about this in an academic term, but I am always interested about first and foremost, why people get into the subjects that they are passionate about. And also, so 2 questions: how did you get into this? Kind of in a nutshell, as much as you can. But the other question is, I'm fascinated to find out whether people have actually experienced themselves, and that played a part in you actually, becoming passionate about the subject.
Okay, well, I actually have a bit of evidence here. I don't know I don't know if I'm going to be able to show you this. Is that going to work? No. This is the Eagle Annual for 1965.
Brilliant.
So as a 10-year-old, I was an avid reader of the Eagle. So it's not going to, you might
yeah,
just
we've got,
see it.
yeah.
It's
That
flashing
is
in and out. Yeah, that's it.
That's the Eagle Annual for 1965. And I treasure this because I was 10 or 11 years old. And there's on page 19, there's an article that says Flying Saucers, Fact or Fantasy by Waveney Girvan, who was then the editor of Flying Saucer Review. And as you turn the page, there are a couple of photographs taken by George Adamski of a flying saucer. And from that age, I was riveted in, dare I say, the nuts and bolts aspect of the subject, that this is nothing to do with funny flying lights or anything like that. This seems to be some unusual piece of technology. And then a few years later, there was another book came out called Piece for a Jigsaw by Leonard Cramp. And I was a bit young for this, but it got me interested in physics and maths. And I still teach mathematics, by the way. But it went into the physics of these craft with G-forces, propulsion systems, force fields, and a whole load of stuff. So it got me on the road of looking at the nuts and bolts physical technology aspect of this, and the possibilities. I know there'll be people watching this who think, well, George Adamski and his photographs are long discredited, but let's not go down that rabbit hole. It was a good starting point to ask the question, whose technology is this? And then coming back to the threat analysis that I was talking about earlier, where the US government chucked $22 million just at that one 5-year program, not to mention all the other programs that have gone on. What are they interested in? Oh, nuts and bolts technology. And there's a very, very simple reason for this. And this was explained to me by a physicist, actually, Dr. Stanton Friedman, who you probably have heard of. And it's very, very simple. If there is some alien technology that is thousands of years in advance of what we have, whoever can get hold of it and understand it and make it work will dominate the planet. Simple as. So, that's the nub of it. And technology has been winning wars since 1066. King Harold wasn't just unlucky. William had technology. He used people that could stand in stirrups on the horses. They had lances. They made use of archers. Whereas the English defenders, I'm afraid, were relying on foot soldiers, hand-to-hand combat, and swords. They were defeated by technology as well as some other factors. So technology has been winning wars from almost 1,000 years ago. So you can see where that's going. And what I've lost my thread now. What was the other question?
Have you had any experiences yourself?
I haven't really had an experience that I think remains totally strange and mysterious. But I've had an experience in another field, which we haven't even been able to get to, and that is the field of remote viewing.
Oh, yes.
I went to the house of a former secretary of mine and her husband, and she had, let's say, some unusual abilities. I mean, the field we were working in together was education, so there was nothing unusual about that. I was an educational project manager, and she was my secretary. But we've stayed friends and stayed in touch. And I went to visit her and her husband, and for no reason that I can even begin to think of, we were talking about something or other. And she suddenly said to me, there's somebody in your workplace who's sabotaging what you're doing, and you need to be aware of the fact that they're undermining you. And I looked at her and I thought, well, you don't actually know what I do. I was a project manager at a university, working on something that was related to the use of technology in education. But she didn't know that. And I didn't know anything about what she was talking about. But because, you know, she has credibility with me, I went back and started finding things that were going wrong and things that weren't going to plan, and, you know, other little unexplained things. A trip I should have taken to meet some professors at a university in Germany, somehow the arrangements all got mucked up and I couldn't go. And sure enough, there was a person undermining what I was doing, and I was getting stabbed in the back for whatever reason. Perhaps it was that they thought they should be the project manager. But the point is, this lady was spot on with something she could not possibly have known about. She didn't know where I worked. She didn't know what I was doing. And I wasn't aware of the problem.
Mm.
And yet when I investigated it, there was a problem. And actually, I handed my resignation in because once I realized that somebody was undermining me, I didn't want to work in that environment anymore, and I jumped ship. And fortunately, I got another job. But it's somebody telling me something they could not possibly have known. I didn't know. So you can't blame me.
So is this lady, are you saying she had previous experience of actual remote viewing or just psychic abilities, or what?
Yes,
how did that work?
she had. I don't know whether to call it psychic ability, or whether it's something more to do with sort of spiritualism. I don't know what the source of the information was. I don't know how she could know, and she wasn't really able to tell me either through choice, or maybe she didn't know where she was getting the information from. In the field of remote viewing, in case just by any chance somebody doesn't know what we're talking about, I'm wondering if I can give you a sort of a quick, concise definition of it. But it does revolve around this ability to perceive information that defies time and space. And therefore, actually, I've got my notes here. It's a sort of controlled and trainable mental process.
Yeah.
I don't like this psychic ability thing, but I'm struggling with language a little bit, as we do in these fields. But it involves PSI, or psychic ability, if you want to call it that, and it's used to transfer perceptual information across time and space. Now, some people don't think it exists, but I can vouch for it. It's clear that remote viewing works in complete violation of the accepted laws of quantum and relativistic physics. So that suggests those laws are incomplete, and there's probably some physicists watching this that are going to have a fit hearing me say that. But it's very, very difficult to explain these things. And even Einstein would not accept something called spooky action at a distance.
Entanglement, yeah.
And yes, you know what I'm talking about, and it's very, very hard to explain. But Dr. Courtney Brown from the Farsight Institute, of which I'm a subscriber, has written a book on remote viewing in which he's tried very hard to explain the possible mechanisms of it that get us into the quantum entanglement world, for want of an abbreviated explanation. So the fact that this lady could tell me something that was an impossibility has made me sit bolt upright. And it's not something I could have leaked to her, because I didn't even know there was a problem, and yet there very definitely was. And it's not the first time that she's done it. Her husband confirmed that she told him things about when he worked in South Africa that he has never mentioned to her, and yet she's able to pull information out of thin air.
It's interesting that you were saying about terminology, and you struggle with the word psychic. For me, the psychic ability is being able to pick up on those without images and without tuning your mind. So you might get a kind of a blast of something that's happening, whether that's clairvoyant, clairsentient, however that comes to you. With remote viewing on a psychic level, for me that's very much about tuning your brain in a meditative state to be able to project yourself to that place. And I mean, this woman, it made me smile, because in days gone by it would have been woman's intuition, you know, and it would have been people would have been quite shocked and quite scared when people had that ability to be able to do that and read situations that they could know nothing about. And I know I've got lots of friends who develop their psychic abilities. I think personally, I think psychic abilities are inherent in all of us as human beings. It's just that we pick them up on different wavelengths and different receivers. But they'll tell you that they can walk into a room and never have met a person before, and literally be able to tell them things that they wouldn't know, you know, that about them at all. We'll have a chat after this, and I do want to get you back to talk about this particular subject, if you like, because remote viewing fascinates me. I absolutely love it, right from the military stuff, you know, to working with the police on different cases, murder cases, etc., to you know, to the everyday use of it. I'll tell you a bit of a story afterwards. But
yeah, we're probably going to overrun, but can I just very quickly tell you that some of the work that the Farsight Institute have done under Dr. Courtney Brown have been to investigate various situations. So the UFO scenarios, they've looked at the Betty and Barney Hill case, for example. They've looked at the assassination of JFK, aliens on Iapetus, which is a moon of Saturn. It really is going down the rabbit hole. Now, I've got some very good friends who simply don't believe in remote viewing. So we're back to this belief thing, which gets a bit under my skin. But I did an experiment in January of last year where I took some remote viewing predictions from 4 remote viewers, and it included peculiar stuff that you could verify in the news if it was going to happen. One very quick example was a situation in a built-up area using cluster bombs. And I thought, well, that's a very unusual thing. I wonder if they're talking about Syria or somewhere like that. And lo and behold, within 4 weeks of those remote viewing sessions, I'm not just talking about one remote viewer, I'm talking about 4. There was a piece of video footage released from a block of flats in Ukraine. So you need to bear in mind the Ukraine war hadn't erupted at that point. This was January. The war started on the 24th of February, and the security camera footage spotted a bomb landing in a car park of a block of flats, and these bomblets flying everywhere and exploding in the car park. And I thought, well, if that isn't a perfect match to what these remote viewers were seeing, I don't know what is. And there was the video evidence to prove it. It's not just a clipping from a newspaper. There was video evidence of it.
Yeah, I mean, naysayers would say, you know, that there are wars going off all over the world that we don't get reported on in this country, and sometimes that snippets do. But you know, that there has been multiple research, parapsychology-wise, where even your remote viewing, in terms of very abstract pictures that people have remote viewed from miles away. You know, a picture is held up, transmitted to a remote viewer, etc. It fascinates me, and we definitely, I would love to have you back and chat with you about that. Before we go, we can't go without talking about more Tea Vicar.
Okay, well, let me tell you what the premise of More Tea Vicar is. The idea was that if you were invited to have tea with the vicar, what do you think you would talk about? Do you think it would be relatively bland, polite, nice conversation? Now, if the vicar is the Reverend Lionel Fanthorpe, the answer is no. For a start, he and his wife are not politically correct, and Lionel is all for jumping straight into the controversy, and he's a dream to work with. I wasn't trying to rip off his For Tea and TV series, but the thought was that he's got many, many more stories that haven't seen the light of day. And so for the first More Tea Vicar, which I'll give you the link to, it's on YouTube, it's free to watch, I filmed 4 stories, one of which was about a time slip. And I won't spoil the whole thing. If people are interested, I'll give you the link and they can see what these stories are about. But it's exploring all sorts of different aspects of the paranormal, what you would call, you know, Fortean phenomena. But the point is, if you're hearing about this from the vicar, does it make it more credible? Is the vicar going to be pulling your leg, telling you a load of blarney, you know, a load of nonsense? So the premise is that no, this is a credible person who's extremely honest, has investigated all sorts of things, doesn't necessarily accept things at face value. And if I talk just briefly about his time slip story, which is in the film, it was a friend of his. It's somebody he knew very well, a credible source, and their wife, and they were involved in a bizarre episode that featured a public lavatory in Norwich, and that's all I'll say for the moment. But you know, there are people who don't believe that there's such a thing as a time slip. Although, of course, coming back to the remote viewing, you are defying the laws of time and space. And once you realize that can be done, then you don't really see the world in quite the same way. But Lionel is what I call a one-take wonder. And I've been able to do a lot of work with him. I've filmed another 12 or 13 stories, which are going to be cobbled together in what I'm calling MTV2, MTV3, MTV4. But I've got some work to do with the editing on these. But you just tell him, oh, can you tell the story of the Green Children of Suffolk? And off he goes. Mm-hmm. There's very little script work. And the only retake I ever had to do with him was in Penlegare Valley Woods. Mark Jones, by the way, another thread there, he's the producer on this. I was directing. And the only reason we had to do a retake was simply because a dog walker, and bearing in mind I got 4 cameras, Lionel's sitting in a chair under a tree, strutting his stuff, as it were, and this dog walker walks onto set, walks in front of the cameras, can see I'm filming, and it's like we're invisible. And I thought, well, do I say something, or am I going to get the entitled reply that, you know, I'm as entitled to be here as you? And I had to reshoot the whole lot. Unbelievable that somebody, you know, comes on with their dog and wrecks everything. Otherwise, there has never been another occasion where I've had to ask Lionel to retell a story.
I can well believe that, because Lionel was a delight to interview last week, and I had sort of 10 questions lined up to ask Lionel, and I got through 2 of them.
Yeah, the only time I use a script is if we need him to make a particular announcement.
Yeah.
Yeah. You just point him in the right direction and off he goes. Yeah. Most of it was unscripted, and I think it's got that spontaneous quality. One criticism I've had of my film is that his study looks like a tip.
I love it. It's
well, like, it's authentic.
Creative chaos.
Yeah,
creative chaos.
Yeah.
I don't want something that was crafted in a studio and the wood's polished and all the rest of it. You know, it's a working. It really is his study. And the good thing is he can find things. Yeah. Oh dear boy, you know, let me just check my notes. Whoosh, there they are. He's a dream. And if you look at the comments associated with my film, you'll see people love his storytelling.
They do. I mean, we've had a fantastic response. You know, some absolutely everybody has remembered him very, very fondly. Yeah. Very fondly.
What people may not realise is that I think he's one of the most prolific science fiction writers of all time. I've lost count of how many books he's written, and he's just got a new one out. I know this sounds a bit naughty. It's not that I want to plug books, but Mark Jones created a character called Sputnik Harris. And he wrote a story. I think Mark's story was called The Quasium Incident. Then he asked Lionel to write a story in this genre. So Lionel wrote a story called The Mystery of the Horologian. And then he asked me to write a story. and I wrote one called The Oracle of Ringstead, which was based on a true story where a guy walked into a bank and asked to be photographed under the sign with the date and the time, and he held up a picture of the Twin Towers being attacked years before it happened. Now, whether that was remote viewing, precognition, whatever you want to call it, but the reason he went to the bank was to prove that this information existed on the date and time when the photograph was taken. And then lo and behold, I mean, the Twin Towers are quite unmistakable. So how could he have forward knowledge of it? Anyway, I used that as a sort of a theme within the version I wrote. Anyway, I'm pleased to say that these 3 books under the title of Sputnik Harris have now gone on to Amazon as ebooks, and Lionel's written one of them, but we'll see what happens. But whereas Mark and Lionel have written pure fiction, mine has got the backing up of some events that really did happen, but names have been changed to protect the guilty, as they say.
Bless you. So as we're wrapping up, what's your future plans? Have you got anything that you can discuss that's sort of coming up in the future for you? Different projects, the Lionel one's a fantastic one, and what else is going on for you?
Well, the super top secret information that I can give you the straight scoop on is that I've got plans for another 3 episodes of more Tea Vicar. They are in the can, all of them. I can't remember whether it's 12 or 13. I mean, it depends on the editing, but these include ghost stories, sort of events that have happened in Penlegare Valley Woods. So all 3 of the new films will be featuring Penlegare Valley Woods. The idea was that Lionel gets out of the rectory and gets out and about. So he's doing some investigation. He's interviewing some people. It's not me interviewing, it's him interviewing some people. One of the stories is where he's interviewing someone who took a ghost picture at a waterfall in Penlegare Valley Woods. So that's what's coming down the pipe. I don't want to get involved in anything else until those 3 films are bolted together, and are out there, because they're running embarrassingly overdue, I have to say. But I would love to work with Lionel again. It may be that because of his health issues and some other things, I'm back to the study within the rectory. In the film, you'll see that it's not said where the church and the rectory are. They're sort of a fictitious setting, but once those are put to bed, I would love to work with him again, filming him in the study, and I've got ideas for other stories that could come out, but I don't want to bite off more than I can chew. Lionel's been very, very patient with me, and the people who were involved in all of these stories have been waiting ages to see them, and I've got to keep them waiting a little bit longer, because I've just lost my editor, and I'm waiting for somebody else to take over the editing, but they should be released in the summer.
Brilliant. Excellent.
So heard first on your show.
Brilliant. I so look forward to seeing those. It's Lionel, if he's so hypnotic to listen to. It's like you just relax.
It's the art of the storytelling, and from a filmmaker's perspective, that is so important, because telling the story and captivating people, from the word go, that is the whole art to it. And he's a master. All of his experience with 4T and TV has stood him in good stead. He really enjoyed doing that series, and he travelled all over the world. But the point is, he's got more stories where they came from.
Yeah, definitely the backing. Bob, we're going to have to wrap up. We could talk for hours and hours. I do hope that you will come back and talk to us in depth and get to the bottom of remote viewing. I hope that's something that, in the next few months we can sort of pin you down. I'm saying this on air, so you can't back out if you say yes.
I'll check my diary. You might be able to twist my arm.
Oh, bless you.
Or send Neil round to persuade me.
You don't want to do that.
No, you don't want to do that. Thank thank you so much for your time and for coming on and talking to us all. As ever, guys, if anybody's got any questions that they want to leave in the comments, we will pass them on to Bob. We do read all your comments, and I'm going to try and sound professional here. Can you please, if you're enjoying the channel, press subscribe and the little bell. I never really know what the little bell's for, but please press it, because it does something that's really positive for the channel. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you again very soon. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks for having me. All the best.
Thank you, Bob.
Bye.